everyone. I'm going to get some of my stuff out of the way there. It's me again, Professor King. I'm going to pull this closer in a moment. But I did want to let you know that today I'm going to be covering essentially just kind of the overall generals of the readings for Tolentino, for Wu, and for Young. So that if you're struggling with any of those, or if you need a little bit of clarification on them, we can hash those out. And then if you have further questions, you can either try and hash them out in the discussion board or email me directly. So I'll pull this forward so you can see my whiteboard a little bit better. Let's see. So I will kind of really extreme close up my computer to this as much as I can so that you can kind of follow along with the things that I'm saying. Okay, so first off, we have Molly Young, and really thinking about the relationship between branding and ethos. If you remember the very first PowerPoint that I shared in class, one of the very first slides that we talked about how ethos is kind of similar to branding in that we're looking at the pattern of someone's behavior, work output, persona, personality, reputation, and that's kind of speaking to whether we believe them or not. And so Young is looking at this idea of branding in a little bit more of a skeptical light, right? And kind of what branding means when it possibly is used by someone, for a fringe element, we'll say. And one thing, there's no reason for me to have these in quotation marks other than to have you remember them. But one thing I want you to think of, excuse me, in terms of this article that a lot of people get tripped up on is that you're seeing like a rhetor within a rhetor, meaning you have Young, the writer of this article, who's making an argument about Amanda Chantel Bacon, the owner of Moon Juice, who's also creating her own products, thereby her own text, thereby creating her own argument, right? So we see how argument is kind of this succession of things, right? Chantel Bacon creates the products, which are texts in and of themselves. Young not only purchases them, but analyzes them and writes this article on them, thereby creating her own text, which is this article that you read for class. So thinking again about like that image I drew on the board of that one day of like the person talking and then the other person turning around and talking and so on and so forth. Sorry, one sec, that's my dog Lionel, he's freaking out. There we go. All right, so things that I would like for you to home in on in terms of what Young talks about is think about how she feels about bacon and about herself in relation to these products that bacon sells, right, or hawks. So really think about kind of the tone that Young is using and approaching all of this with. And that really speaks to the content of the article. For bacon, I'm not going to go into too much discussion about that because you'll notice your discussion board, that's what the DB stands for, kind of synthesizes your chapter 14 PowerPoint notes that are posted with analyzing some of Bacon's texts, meaning the products that she sells. So just look out for that in the discussion board. Make sure you answer clearly and thoroughly and really think about this stuff and respond to somebody else, obviously. But I won't go into too much depth there. Some noteworthy items that I really want people to walk away with that I always want to talk about and I feel like students kind of overlook sometimes. The scene, I call it a scene, even though this is technically like a journalistic article. The scene where Young goes to Bacon's house, right, and describes it in detail. And particularly the moment that the maid kind of enters into the picture. This has always struck me, and I wonder if it struck you too, and if so, what you think about it. And then at the very end, Alex Jones is kind of a person who has gone out of vogue, even on the far fringe right that he was popularized, that he sort of popularized himself with. But at the time, this is a few years old, this article, Young makes this comparison between Amanda Chantel Bacon and Alex Jones. And so if you don't know who he is, it's probably a good idea to like Google some videos of him and just kind of see what he's about and the things that he talks about. And again, the persona and the personality that he puts forth into the world. But Young makes this sort of comparison and contrast with their products that I've always thought is really fascinating. So that might be another thing you want to check out. So again, think about Young in terms of those things. But we're going to move on to Woo. Woo, I kind of just pulled some quotes and stuff. Woo was pretty accessible, I think. He does this weird thing where he starts off his chapters, they're really easy to read, and then he goes into this very sort of academic language. But I hope that you got some stuff out of him. So the first one I'm going to start with is, the How We Got Here, the introductory chapter that we looked at, where he's talking about the rise of what he calls the attention merchants. And really, in the discussion board, I talked about them as advertisers, but really they go beyond advertisers, beyond just sort of a sort of blanket understanding of advertising and marketing in the media to really selling attention, right? Like thinking about the world that we live in now. Particularly, he talks about Instagram in the second chapter that we looked at. But this idea of the selling of attention, right? And the effect, which, the idea that we as a society, right, are fine with our lives being commercially exploited. Let me just close that quote here because it's going to drive me crazy. Thanks. So he's kind of saying like that this hasn't always been that way. And it's taken different forms and different iterations, from the newspaper to the radio to the television to now, the phone. But thinking about this idea of like, our lives being commercially exploited, and even going one step further, thinking about the influence of consciousness. In other words, how do these attention merchants, right, these companies, like the educational, marketing software company that he talks about at the beginning, how they influence our very consciousness, which is huge, right? This cannot be just sort of flippantly understated, right? Like this idea that marketing and products and we as brands and all of this is just commerce and commercialization and commodification have become wedded and or embedded into our consciousness, right? Like that is a huge idea. So maybe take a few minutes to kind of riff on that in your brain for a moment, right? But that the influence of consciousness is the job of the attention merchants, is the business, he calls it, of the attention merchants. And then he talks about like, will we revolt? And if we revolt, will it be successful, right? Like, will we come together to create a different collective consciousness? And maybe on your own, think about what that might look like, like imagine all the stuff we're going through right now, which everyone's talking about all the time, right? But like imagine if we didn't have cell phones and how that would look. And imagine if we weren't constantly on Instagram or on our social media sites, or not even our social media sites, but web browsing and shopping and ads everywhere and cookies and all this stuff, right? Like, what would it look like if that was divorced from our consciousness, from our everyday waking lives, is kind of something really to think about. And this kind of goes into the second chapter we look at, which is the fourth screen, right? And when he says the fourth screen, he's talking about cell phones, particularly apps, right? Like the Facebook, but he acknowledges that Facebook is kind of gone the way of the dinosaur at this point, at least, you know, in most people's minds. But he focuses on Instagram and these attention apps that are just the latest iteration of their commercialization of the self, right? Again, of their influence of consciousness. So think about that, right? Like, I know that I am a very old dinosaur at 37 years old, but I didn't have a cell phone until I was 21. And I can remember a whole world that existed before anybody walked around with cell phones. And I know that's, for people who are younger, that's a really kind of crazy thing to think about, like not having a cell phone on you at all times. But it did exist, right? And it existed a very short time ago. And so, like, thinking about how now we are so dependent on these things, how we do everything on them, right? Like, we have our schedule, we have our alarm, we have the people we get in contact with, the things we buy, you know, virtually our entire lives almost are on these things, right? And so the effect that that has on our consciousness is huge. And so what are these apps? What are these attention merchants? How are they infiltrating our consciousness vis-a-vis these cell phones, right? It's something to think about. And all of this leads us to Tolentino, because Tolentino is going to be that major book that we are going to be discussing, you know, essentially from the time we return from break into, you know, the end of the semester. We'll have other things that we'll be reading and looking at, but that's going to be kind of the centerpiece, right? So all of these readings, even Jung and Wu, they dance around a lot of these issues that are attacked a little more thoroughly, we'll say, in Tolentino. So Tolentino's chapter is also, you know, a beginning chapter. It's a first chapter, The I and Internet. And in this chapter, I would say, you know, she's different from Wu in that, you know, we're looking at a variety of ways that identities can converse with and are shaped by the internet, right? And there are these 5 specific ways she talks about, sort of towards the middle of the chapter, she lists them and then goes into depth about them. Let me grab my book. Just give me one moment, guys. Sorry, I should have been slightly more prepared, but whatever. Let's see. Okay, let's see. I'm sure this is thrilling for you to just listen to me kind of rifle through a book. So on page 12 of the text, she talks about the 5 intersecting problems of the internet, right? And you know, how it's built to distend our sense of identity, how it encourages us to overvalue our opinions, how it maximizes our sense of opposition, how it cheapens our understanding of solidarity, and how it destroys our sense of scale. And then she goes into this really cool discussion where she applies these ideas from the sociologist Irving Goffman into sort of this idea of how our presentation of ourselves is a performance, right? And how life is like a stage, but we have a curtain that we can hide behind, right? And communicating is this sort of performance. I mean, you got to read it. It's great stuff, right? So to think about all of those things in connection with identity, right? Sorry, I'm just page 12 here. You know, because identity is not something that is fixed, right? It's not something where, you know, my identity that I had when I was 5 is the identity I have now, right? It's changing, it's fluid. It requires a communication with the outside world. It requires a back and forth, right? When we think of identity, we think of an individual, but really when we think about identity, we have to think about how it's in communication with others, people, entities, institutions, the attention merchants, right, et cetera, et cetera. And we have to think about how that affects the individual and how the individual affects others. And so thinking about identity, right, this very rich, complex discussion that Tolentino has about identity, my final question for you is, why self-delusion, right? Why do you think she is concerned with this idea of self-delusion? So maybe make some predictions about that. So that, my friends, is the end of this WebTeach of the class. Oh, great, you all get to see how messy my room is. Sorry, my computer's at 4%, so I'm just charging it right now. So those are the questions. Again, if you need further clarification or elaboration on them, feel free to talk about it in the discussion board or email me or respond to other people's posts, read other posts. That's what you're supposed to be doing in the discussion board, not just posting your own, post in a reply and then ignoring it forever. These are really thoughtful ideas that we're going to share with one another to really do something with these readings, right? So good luck on those readings. I hope this clarified a little bit. Have a wonderful, what is it, Monday? The days are gone, right? They're nowhere to be found. Yeah, I'll see you, hopefully I'll see some of you on Thursday in our class drop-in meeting. So hopefully I'll see you then. All right, bye.